Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary based on a real-life serial killer. And this is one that I picked up somewhat recently, so it is one that I do own. But if it's something that you would like to check out, I do believe it is for free on YouTube. I think I found it for free on YouTube before I actually bought it. Now, this is one that's based on another killer that I have never talked about in documentary or film. I do know that there is a film on him, I think from 2009, very low budget. I haven't been able to find it anywhere. But this is a very different kind of documentary. I'm almost hesitant to call it a documentary, almost more like a shockumentary. It was produced by Troma, if that tells you anything. Like a serial killer documentary put out by Troma. That should already tell you that this is going to be very different. But it's from 2004 at very low budget. I'd probably say it's closer to the John Borowski serial killer documentaries, like the Albert Fish one, Carl Pangeram, or H.H. Holmes, all three of which I have reviewed. But it was directed by Benjamin Mead, and it's the 2004 film Bazaar, which it's a very bizarre film, so it's definitely deserving of the title. But it's about 1980s serial killer Robert Berdella, aka the Kansas City Butcher, sometimes called the Collector, based on his influence of the 1965 film of the same name, which is based on a book by John Fowles. No, the 2009 Collector is not a remake of it, despite what people might want to say. It has the same title, it's about a killer. Apparently that's all you need. Which, I don't even think this mentions the film The Collector, or even that kind of being his moniker. But it's only 89 minutes, so it's rather short. It's closer to the John Borowski films because it's sort of half movie, half documentary. Lots of dramatizations, kind of has a theme to it. It's either like a Chainsaw Massacre-esque dramatization, or it's a very goofy, schlocky, sometimes offensive, campy, low-budget Troma kind of film. But with all these talking head interviews from people involved with the Robert Berdella case, whether it be the officers closely involved, the Kansas City locals who knew Berdella personally, the surviving victim, Chris Bryson, Robert Berdella's reverend that he had in prison, and some of the reporters that reported on the case when it first came out. So it has a lot of talking heads that are very closely involved with the story, which I always think is a plus. You know, it does give it that closer, more intimate feel by having all these people closely involved with the case or the killer. It does have a host. It's hosted by James Ellroy, who's a true crime writer, and he pops up every now and again to sort of punctuate or set up the next segment. It almost feels like he's playing a character. He doesn't shy away from any thoughts he has. Because another thing we get is a bunch of clips from the 1989 interview that Berdella did. If you've seen a Berdella interview, it's probably that one. It's one that I've seen a bunch of times. And whenever Berdella will make a point, will cut back to Ellroy. Even at one point where Berdella is saying how, the part where he says, "I'm not going to say no one understands me, but I do deserve sympathy." Cut back to Ellroy, who's like, "Bobby, poor Bobby, oh Bobby." It almost feels like he's playing a character. But it is about half dramatization, half documentary. Very, very low budget documentary. So it does feel more like a John Borowski film rather than an A&E or Netflix or Tubi documentary. And another thing it doesn't shy away from is showing, I don't even know if I can show it, a lot of the Polaroids. I'll just leave it this far out. The Polaroids he took of his victims while they were in captivity, being tortured. It doesn't shy away from showing stuff like that, even if it's quick flashes. So that's all interesting. It's definitely deserving of the title of Bazaar, which even the title Bazaar is a play on the sort of oddities shop that Berdella had at a flea market in Kansas City, where he had all this weird stuff from around the world. He claimed he was a world traveler. He would sell it at the flea market. So the title is a play on that, and it is a very bizarre film. I mean, the dramatizations are either very gritty, grainy, kind of slow motion, with this very ambient, ominous sounding score that's very Chainsaw Massacre-esque. It ranges from being pretty graphic to, because it does go over all 6 of his victims. Robert Berdella was a homosexual serial killer who killed 6 young men between 1984 and late 1987, and then in April of 88, well, in late March of 88, he abducted his final victim, Bryson, who on the 3rd day of captivity, he escaped. Berdella was arrested on April 2nd of 88. And it does go over all 6 victims, but it ranges, it varies in what it shows. It almost always shows how the victim met Berdella, them at his house, him drugging them, and then dragging them into the next bedroom. Sometimes that's all it shows. Sometimes it will show various stages of torture that he would inflict, or the dismemberment of the victims and the burial in the backyard of the skulls and certain parts that he kept. But it doesn't always show that. But every time a victim does come up, it'll kind of have these red, bloody letters with the victim's name and the amount of time that they were held captive. And that's one of my gripes with the film is not all the times are correct. A lot of them, I'd probably say at least half of them are incorrect. Like, I think there's one that says 72 hours, but that victim was held for just over 24. Or it'll say a little under 24 hours, but they're really held for like 7. So the hours of most of them are off. Some of the torture, it kind of treats the torture as a whole, like they all got it, even though that's not necessarily true. Some of the torture they all got, but some of them were more extreme than others, and sometimes it'll show torture that this other victim got with this one. So it's not the most in-depth or the most accurate. I would probably suggest more so reading a book like Rites of Burial, or I would much rather just watch like an A&E biography, or if there was one on Tubi or Netflix, because he is a very fascinating figure. He is very interesting. It does go into the kind of public figure that he was, how he was not liked by people in Kansas City, the condescending, arrogant, just not really liked by most people. But other than that, like, it really only kind of covers his life in Kansas City, his victims, his shop, what locals thought of him, and then just some of the mystery around him, like it's never been proven, but the mystery of how he supposedly, or the rumor that he served human flesh at a potluck at the flea market, which some of those dramatizations are meant to be Troma, meant to be like Troma and goofy with kind of over-the-top silly music. There is the dramatization of him making a potluck with human fingers, and the guy playing Berdella is very over-the-top and silly, which I will say, I'm sure the guy's not a very good actor. All the scenes with him, at least, there's no dialogue, it's all sound. But they got a guy to look just like Robert Berdella. I mean, as far as looks go, they nailed it. So like, I pray that he's a good actor, and if they ever made a movie, like, well, there is the 2009 film, but I haven't seen it yet. Get someone like him to play him. So it's not the most factual. It doesn't go at all into his, pre-Kansas, uh, pre-Kansas City life, like his obsession with the film The Collector, his relationship with his father, how he was bullied at school. It does kind of go into some of the psychological elements, like, yes, probably the biggest example is when his last victim that he killed, Larry Pearson, bit down on his penis so bad that he had to go to the hospital. Apparently that happened a few times, so we do get an interview with one of the ER doctors saying how after so many times of that kind of surgery, a repair surgery, it kills all the nerves, so you can't really get stimulated. So how for Berdella, the torture and sexual sadism was more about power, dominance, and inflicting pain rather than the actual sex itself. It does go a bit into the psychological aspects of Berdella. But yeah, it's not very in-depth. A lot of the information, at least consider when it comes to some of the victims, are incorrect. The only real plus... Oh, well, before I get to that, it does get very goofy at times. In fact, there's another scene kind of like the one that... The really goofy scene where it shows him cooking with human meat. There's like this 30-second clip with a 30-second timer with the words warning, and it's showing the more graphic, sexually graphic tortures involving cucumbers and carrots. Kind of with that similar kind of silly music. So you can definitely tell it's put out by Troma. But also there's like at least 3 or 4 sequences where we get these essentially music videos, because it does go into how in Kansas City after his arrest there was this sort of Berdella parody movement where all these local musicians were making parody songs. They were having costume parties dressed up as him, and it does show these videos made for the film, but of those parody songs. And yeah, they are kind of Weird Al, kind of silly parody songs. So it's definitely weird. It's definitely low budget. I mean, some of the interviews are kind of hard to hear, especially that of Chris Bryson. Because Chris Bryson, he does have a very thick southern accent. He is in this hallway that's very echoey. So some of the interviews are kind of hard to hear. Very, I don't want to say poorly made, but very low budget. Sometimes it's hard to tell what's a dramatization and what's actors. Like, there's one interview with these neighbors the day after the arrest, and it was kind of hard to tell, like, is that real? Is that dramatization? The scenes with the guys going down to the basement to kind of do like a crime scene search, because the house has been torn down. It does show us the vacant lot after his house was torn down. So is this like archive footage of a evidence search? Is it actors? It is kind of hard to tell sometimes the dramatization from what possibly could be archive footage. But it does have some news footage as well, news audio. You do get a bunch of clips from that 1989 interview with Berdella. So there is a lot to take away from it, but some of the silliness, a lot of the dramatizations, it does kind of take you out of it. Some of the dramatizations are well done in a very low budget, Chainsaw Massacre-y type way, but it varies so much in what they show. And how inaccurate some of it is. And yeah, the thing about Berdella is it is kind of open to what he might have done to a lot of his victims, but it does go into his detailed journal, like how he jotted down everything he did and wanted to experiment with his victims. So that's kind of how we know he did a lot of these things. It doesn't feel like it's as in depth or as informative as a documentary could or should be. It does feel more kind of like a Troma student film, like someone from Kansas City kind of trying to do this local legend kind of film. So it felt more like that rather than a serial killer documentary. The closest I could compare it to would be the John Borowski films, but even I would say those were more informative and well made than this one. It's still worth checking out, but yeah, I would still much prefer like an A&E biography, Netflix type documentary. So not really a whole lot to say about it, really. But yeah, it is worth checking out, especially if you're into the Bob Berdella story. Otherwise, I would just assume you'll grab a book like Rites of Burial or something. So yeah, that is Troma's Bazaar by Benjamin Mead. So I guess now we'll get into the short summary and then what it actually covers. Robert Berdella, aka the Kansas City Butcher, was a serial killer who drugged, held captive, tortured, and sexually assaulted 6 young men between 1984 and 1987, before his capture on April 2, 1988, following the escape of his final victim. He has also been called the Collector after the 1965 film of the same name, which Berdella had said he was inspired by. Berdella knew of most of his victims, a number of them being male prostitutes and drug addicts. One was even court appointed to him for drug counseling. His MO included inviting them into his home, which was said to be cluttered and full of junk, drugging them by various means, and then restraining them to a bed and submitting them to torture such as electric shocks to muscles and genitals, ammonia to the eyes, and drain cleaner injected into their throats, and rape. He would also rape them with various objects, such as cucumbers and carrots. The amount of time his victims were held captive ranged from several hours to 6 weeks. Most succumbed to their torture. He would then dissect and dismember his victims either in a bathtub or in his basement, saving several skulls, burying them in his backyard, and leaving the rest in garbage bags on the curb to be taken away. Despite no full bodies, just parts, being accounted for, we know all of his crimes from detailed journal entries and Polaroids that Berdella took throughout his torture. Berdella is also known for his oddities shop at the local flea market called Bob's Bizarre Bazaar, containing items from all over the world, claiming to be a traveler, and was also known to be a condescending, full of himself, and arrogant to the locals. His last victim, Chris Bryson, was able to escape after 3 days of torturous captivity by jumping out of the second-story window. He was seen running down the street naked, bleeding, and only wearing a dog collar. Berdella was arrested on the 2nd of April, 1988, and gave a full confession that December. He was convicted of 2 charges of first-degree murder and 4 counts of second-degree. He died of a heart attack 4 years later in 1992, though it was never proven. It is believed that due to his attitude and behavior in prison, that his heart medication was withheld from him, causing his attack. It has also never been proven, but widely believed that Berdella served the flesh of his victims to patrons of his shop. His legacy in Kansas City since his arrest has led to numerous parody songs, and many personal items have been sold as murderabilia, including his chainsaw that sold for $20,000. Berdella's House of Horrors has since been demolished and is still a vacant lot. So now we're going to what the film covers. First, we're introduced to true crime writer James Ellroy, who's sort of our host throughout the film. He explains to us that sexual psychopaths and serial killers often torture their victims first, reveling in the power that they have over their victims, and sometimes ejaculate without penetration, as they are so aroused. He goes into how sex is the greatest pleasure we seek. It is the course of many things, including serial murder. He mentions how homosexual men kill homosexual men, heterosexual men kill women, you kill within your racial profile, and you kill within your sexual profile. Which, not always. I did make a note that Joseph Paul Franklin killed black men, as you know, he was a racist, a serial killer, uh, but also women who liked black men. And John Bunting was a straight man who killed homosexuals thinking that they were pedophiles. So it is rare, but it happens. So from there we go into our first of many dramatizations. A lot of the film is really shot on video, grainy, kind of slow motion dramatizations. This one is set March 28th of 88, where we see a guy, I'm guessing it's supposed to be the final to-be victim that escaped, Chris Bryson, shows him hitchhiking. These hippies pick him up, but they're going the opposite way, so he gets out. We cut back to James Ellroy on a sexual sadist, finding pleasure and dominance, that they're cowardly, weak, yet arrogant, feeling it's okay to take a life. He even uses the term, they're sacks of shit. And this is all put to photos of bound and gagged victims of Robert Berdella, which some of them I think are the dramatization actors. Then he introduced that this is on a serial sex killer, Bob Berdella, who terrorized Kansas City. We get a dramatization of Chris Bryson escaping from the house, the second-story window, completely nude, except for a dog collar, which is true. Only in the dramatization, it shows him jumping down to like a lower roof and then kind of sliding down. Where in real life, I think he just jumped straight from the second-story window. It does show blood all over his rear end, which I thought was a nice touch because he was severely assaulted and tortured. But he's not limping. Also, Bryson broke a foot during the jump, which it kind of mentions in another dramatization, but here he's not limping. But it does have a nice Texas Chainsaw Massacre style score or sound effects, which, again, is a huge plus for this that I liked. Then we get like the intro, which has Berdella's sketches and drawings, but also photos of sex and torture, and of drawings and photos of sex and torture, and of Bob Berdella himself. We get the dramatization showing him running down the street naked, collared, and bloody. News audio of his escape. It shows people walking through the actual house. That was kind of hard to tell if it was dramatization or not. I'm thinking it was because it does go into how the house was tore down shortly after he died. But there was a big investigation in his house as well. The actor's voice describing how he met Berdella and got to the house, shown through dramatization, shows his getting hit in the head with an iron bar and waking up tied to the bed, naked, which is true. The only reason why I'm saying true is because some of the dramatizations and captions aren't exactly true. Shows him being shocked, injecting Drano into his throat and putting ammonia in his eyes, which was all stuff that he did to his victims, and showing Berdella rape him. All with no audio, but with voiceover from the actor saying what happened to him. It shows the basement where he dismembered his victims, the drain, which I don't know if the men in this are actors or if it's archive footage. That drain cover, though, I did see, I think on Cult Collectibles for, I think, like $4,500, which I think I mentioned that earlier, along with his $20,000 chainsaw that has since sold. A band plays a song about Berdella. You get that a few times in here. A bartender's interviewed says he was 16 at the time of the murders, or his arrest. Him and his then girlfriend would go to Bob's Bazaar on weekends. They thought he was cool, thought he was a world traveler and had a bunch of odd things. We're introduced to Reverend Roger Coleman on when he first met Bob, how Bob was suicidal. He was brought in to help him so he'd stay alive. Also, how Kansas City had started to make Bob Berdella jokes and not really take the crime seriously, which he wanted to change. We're introduced to Albert Reinerer, if I pronounce that correctly, who was the former prosecutor. He talks about the circumstances of the arrest. It was the day before Easter. NCAA championship was in Kansas City, and it was a re-election year for the prosecutor. How the arrest served as part of the re-election campaign. And then throughout the film, we get footage from the 1989. Oh, that's not here yet, but Reinerer saying how Berdella should be executed. But yeah, we do continuously get footage from the 1989 interview that Berdella did. Retired Sergeant Troy Cole, thinking initially it was just a homosexual lover's quarrel that would be resolved, which many cases back then were like that. Male-on-male sexual assault was always seen as like a lover's quarrel. Retired Officer Tom Moss, how he was head of fugitive apprehension and missing persons cases. 2 missing persons cases reported in Kansas City at that time, and the common factor in both was Bob Berdella. Karen Blakeman, court reporter for Kansas City Times, and Tom Jackman, the police reporter for Kansas City Times, both on the breaking of the story. Jackman is actually standing in front of the flea market where Bob's Bazaar once was. It tells what that was, Bob's Bazaar, how people thought he was a, quote, condescending dickhead, which that kind of was his reputation around town. 1993 archive footage of Berdella in his shop and how he started it. That should have said 1983 instead of 93. Jackman on how the weekend he was caught was the big Kansas City basketball games, how Berdella didn't give a shit about basketball, which neither do I. So to capitalize on tourists, he put 4 skulls in the window and a sign that said Final Four. I don't know if that's a basketball term, but he didn't really explain it. How his victims were young white males, mostly male prostitutes, ones he was able to proposition and pick up. Reiterman on how Berdella had some sort of vendetta against any kind of slight towards him and taking it out on these men. So then we cut to the dramatization of December 13th, 1988, of his confession, which he pled guilty on the 19th, even though in this dramatization he's brought in for a confession. And then dramatization of the murder of Jerry Howell, and then whenever we get one of the murders, it will say their name in like these bloody letters, and it's kind of shady, shaky and gritty. And then it will say the time frame for which he held them captive. Most of these are wrong as far as what I've read. So like it says Jerry Howell and then 48 hours, though I read he was held for 28 hours. It shows how they met, smoking pot together, dragging him unconscious, which actually he drugged him with diazepam and acipromazine, then taking him into the basement to disembowel him. So I guess it skips over the 28 hours of bedroom captivity, rape, and torture. Cut back to James Ellroy, saying Berdella had a long love affair with male anatomy, comparing it to a kid with an erector set, wanting to take it apart, see how it works. This is the ultimate objectification. And then, I don't know if this was a dramatization, but neighbors interviewed the day after the arrest. Dramatization of the murder of Robert Sheldon. It says 72 hours, which he was kept between April 12th and April 15th of 85, so about 72 hours. Though it depicts him knocking him out with blunt force when actually he drugged him. Shows him being tortured, shocked, being dismembered, and his head buried in the backyard. Only it shows him being dissected and dismembered in the basement, when I believe it was actually in the third floor bathroom that he did that in. We're introduced to Jim McKinley, a reporter, on how he got involved and eventually interviewed Berdella. So from here on, this is when we get footage of that interview from January 2nd, 1989. If you look up Bob Berdella interview, it's this one. I think it's the only one that he ever did. But this one clip is the part about the media turning him into a monster and treating him the way he treated his victims and how it's biased. Someone being pushed to do a monstrous act, but that's not a monster. So pretty much saying he was pushed to do these monstrous acts, but that doesn't make him a monster. And then almost every time we have that, we cut back to Ellroy kind of commenting on this. Which, then Ellroy commenting on that, saying it's bullshit, and if he hadn't been caught, he'd still be killing. We're introduced to Dr. Marilyn Richardson on how Berdella had been to the ER 2 or 3 times to have his penis reattached or patched up. How that kind of surgery can kill the nerves and not get any kind of sensation. So his activities must have been more about power and dominance rather than stimulation, especially after that many times of doing that kind of surgery. We're introduced to Kevin Kelly, who is a Kansas City florist, on how his first thought when hearing of the arrest was another case of police going after another gay man, goes into his experiences of gay bashing and prejudice from police. Introduced to Barbara Roos, Kansas City hairdresser, how she cut Berdella's hair and her boss would have appointments made by Berdella himself for his future victims to, quote, help them find a job. Rick Flavel, former neighbor, on getting Valium from Berdella, sometimes by pressure, and not believing he was any kind of victim, but saw a photo of himself on TV that was taken from Bob's property. Pat Harrington, Kansas City mechanic, on how they pretty much ran Berdella away for constantly arguing about what was wrong with his car, and his brother being in the police department academy at the time, and when Berdella was caught, his brother was one of the officers that excavated Berdella's backyard, and that says, glad he got what came to him. Dramatization of Mark Wallace, it says 48 hours, though I read it was closer to a day. Shows him hiding in the shed for shelter, which is true. It was a rainstorm. Then right to him being tortured with needles in his back, which is true. He injected possibly chlorpromazine and into various muscles. Then taking Polaroids and notes in his diary, which this will touch on his diary as well. More footage from the 89 interview. Being asked if he agrees with the prosecutor's quote, these crimes are wantonly evil, vile, and inhuman, he says that he will disagree. This part was kind of hard for me to understand because we do get an interview with Chris Bryson, the victim that escaped, but he's darked out or obscured by shadow upon a stairwell that's very echoey, and he has a very thick southern accent. So between that and the acoustics in the hallway, it was kind of hard to understand him, and there's no subtitles on the DVD. So I tried my best. But he talks about the torture of being strapped to the bed, shocked to the testicles, the potato sack over his head and choked, beaten, a hypodermic needle to the throat, Q-tips to the eyes. That's how he administered the ammonia. And then getting sick, but Berdella trying to keep him alive. And then we come back to James Ellroy, comparing Berdella to Joseph Mengele of the Nazi doctor who committed a bunch of heinous experiments. He compares them in their experiments because Berdella was pretty much experimenting with torture. Reporter Tom Jackman actually standing at the vacant lot where Berdella's home was about what he do to these young men in detail and, and take photos and jot it in his notes or diary. That's how we knew that he did these things. Which he mentions fucking and sodomy with carrots and cucumbers and how he would code different things in his diary. Like carrot fuck or cucumber sodomy, stuff like that. So then we get footage in the 89 interview about the meticulous diaries he kept with a photo of a plastic bag with loose paper and photos. And I do remember this part of the interview. He says how the media says that he took these meticulous notes, but it was all loose leaf paper. So he's trying to argue that it's like this is not I think this is like Peruvian parchment or something. So pretty much saying like, well, they're not meticulous notes. They're just, it's just a loose leaf scratch notes, trying to justify it. Really just pulling at hairs to argue with the media that he's not as bad. More of how the media is painting him as a monster. And then we get a 30-second dramatization with a warning of the more graphic parts of the torture, such as carrot and cucumber torture. Very gritty, very shot on video, word warning flashing. It very poorly acted, but you see the actor here, the cucumber here, with kind of goofy music put over it. Definitely the most Troma part of the whole picture. Come back to James Ellroy on how excruciating this must have been and how Berdella deserved the death penalty, despite not believing in it, and likes to think he's suffering with, quote, the Prince of Darkness shoving a hot poker up his ass. Get a dramatization of the murder of Walter Ferris, 24 Hours, which he's also known as James Ferris, and it was approximately 27 hours. Shows him being drugged in the arm, though I read he was drugged via food. Then shows him dead in the tub as Berdella takes Polaroids, which it shows real photos flashing on screen that he took of him. Which, this is the victim he later said he increased his brutality. It was the first he intentionally inflicted pain. And he stopped or made less notes as he thought that the victim couldn't take much more if he stopped to take notes. He suffered shocks to the shoulder and genitals and acupuncture there as well. Then it shows him being dismembered in the tub. James Ellroy on the vulnerability of his victims, male prostitutes, broken homes, drugs. It goes into the lack of care from the media and law enforcement towards the victims for who they were and where they came from. And then one of the interviewed officers, I think it was the one from the apprehension of missing persons, he disputes this. Another one saying that if they had come from more prominent families, then they'd have more resources and information to find them. But very little was known about them, but that's not the victim's fault. And then a third one saying that they all came from working families. James Ellroy on how male prostitutes at the time should have been worried about disappearances or not have been prostitutes. Chris Bryson on not being a prostitute but willing to get drugs from Berdella. We're introduced to a guy named Skid Row, who's a Kansas City radio personality, on being a DJ back then and making a parody song about Berdella and how he would put anything funny on the air. We get a clip in the 89 interview being asked about the parody song and people throwing parties dressed as him and him saying that he hadn't heard it but hearing that the families were upset. Skid Row on how he came up with it, to the tune of Donovan's Mellow Yellow, which it plays a bit of the song with a music video, I think, made for the film. Which, again, the guy playing Berdella in this film, even though he doesn't have any lines, he may not be a good actor, but he looks the part of Berdella very well. Same clip of the interview saying that he was also upset by it. We come back to Reverend Roger Coleman on how he thought he knew evil and death, and then after the meetings he had with Berdella and keeping their sessions to himself, he dropped a substantial amount of weight and it affected his personal life. Reporter Karen Blakeman, on her first interview with Bob, how he demanded an extra recorder for himself, which was then confiscated, and how he talked about being a court-appointed person for troubled youth, and how a judge named Marcia Walsh vouched for him, even after the fact of his arrest, which then we get text on the screen saying, in 1984, Judge Marcia Walsh ordered Todd Stoops to undergo drug counseling through probation with Mr. Berdella. She recently stated she didn't remember him or the case, which, how could you not? I don't know if it said didn't remember the Berdella case or doesn't remember Stoops or his case. But then we get a dramatization of Todd Stoops, 13 Days, which he was kidnapped June 17th and he was killed July 1st. So he died the 14th day. Shows him drugging him in the arm, dragging him down the hall, and then tied to the bed. Which it shows him like Todd Stoops' head is here, Berdella's behind him, pulling out a bloody fist. So there's that. Which Todd Stoops was the victim that he did rupture his rectal wall, which led to profuse bleeding. He also shocked his eyes to attempt blinding him and injected drain cleaner into his throat to keep him silent, which the latter it shows him trying to inject something into his eye. Clip in the interview about serving remains at his shop and Berdella saying no, he never did, but saying that the food was good and not suspect, which this was never proven. It was never proven that he actually fed his victims to people at his shop. But there's a dramatization, another silly one with silly music, about him making a potluck with human fingers. How he put cut-up bodies in trash bags and left them on the curb for the trash. And it worked, which it does go into how brazen or careless you have to be to do that. It shows a dramatization of this. An appraiser talks about the time he went to appraise Berdella's home and noticed the largest garbage disposal he'd ever seen, which then we get a food disposal technician showing us a bisected garbage disposal and showing us how it works. We get the dramatization of Larry Pearson, 43 days, which it was approximately 6 weeks, which it just shows them drinking and then him beaten while strapped to the bed and then dismembered in the tub, which at first he was held in the basement and then he was moved up to the second floor after earning his trust. He endured some of the same torture, shocks, though he was dismembered in the basement and head saved in the freezer and then buried, or head saved in the freezer, then head buried. This was the victim that bit down on Bob's penis, sending him to the hospital. Clip of the 89 interview, Berdella on police, knowing what was going on and how the families must feel that their loved ones were written off by the police. How he wished that they did intervene, but they would have caught him, they would have just scared him off. Then it goes into the lack of responsibility he took for his actions. It goes into 6 victims, which James Ellroy comments on how 6 victims in 4 years is low for a typical serial killer, and their urges, but Berdella spent a lot of time with his victims and their parts. He was a hoarder killer. He also needed his house for what he did, so 6 and 4 years sounds about right. Because it goes into, like, was it only 6 victims, or could there have been more? Which he even compares him to William Bonney, who had a much larger body count, which he killed, I think it was 21 or 22, in just a fraction of the time. I think it was like less than 2 years. But he was a road killer, so that's how he was able to do it. Coleman on Berdella never alluding to there being more than 6. One of the officers interviewed saying he believes that it's only 6. Berdella made his deal, so his punishment wouldn't change, and he also stuck with 6. We get text. According to police records, 47 people were reported missing from the area of 10th and McGee Streets between 84 and 88, who were still never accounted for. Chris Bryson talked about the first couple days of his captivity, not knowing if his sight will come back from all the ammonia, his arms going numb from being restrained and outstretched, knowing he wasn't going to be let go, putting faith in God. Day 4, he convinced Berdella to tie his hands in front of him instead of like that. Next day, he managed to get matches, because I guess Berdella would always give him a cigarette, and this time he left the matches. So he managed to get the matches, burn his restraints, trying the window, not knowing if it would open or how high up he was. But it opened, and trying to jump over into the next yard, but he just fell straight down. He does go into more detail than that. Which then we get another Bob Berdella parody song, another clip from the 89 interview, saying, "I'm not going to say no one understands me, but he does have remorse," which then we get James Ellroy mocking him, like, "Bobby, poor Bobby," and saying he deserves no sympathy. He quotes some article as well. Another clip from the 89 interview. Asked if he's worried about being moved from his cell to the big prison, saying he's more concerned about the police and guards than other inmates, or inmates acting on their own, that he didn't get the death penalty, so maybe they'll try to set him up. Coleman on Bob's death, the claims that the prison system withheld his heart meds, and that's what caused his heart attack, his refusal to be part of any kind of investigation into that, and how he condemns the prison system. But then says, knowing Bob probably got himself into some sort of position anyway for the kind of prisoner that he was, which he was very pushy and difficult. But if it is true, it's a shame, and it's not up to anyone. It's not up to us to make those kinds of decisions, despite who it may be towards. Some of the interviewees on him getting what he deserved, though he should have lived longer, since he was a control freak and didn't have any in prison. He loved his celebrity, but eventually people would lose interest, and that would be like a suffering to him. Get another Berdella parody song. News footage and audio of Bob's death shows photos of his 6 victims after they were dead, so Polaroids that he took, and the tearing down of his home and the excavation of his property. Goes into the aftermath of the case, reporter Blakeman on being obsessed with it and having to give it up, and then other interviewees on how we need the facts out there because there's still a lot of myth about the Berdella case. And then James Ellroy saying Berdella got off easy and deserves no sympathy. That tells the viewers to, in the future, be careful, especially cautious around strangers. And if you're women, gay men, it says, or if you're women, gay men, or women, so I didn't type that out right, as you fit the victim profile, and it helps to be cautious because there are demons like Bob Berdella out there, and they do exist. And then he thanks us for watching. Then we get another Berdella parody song over the credits. So that is Troma's Bazaar. It's not bad. I've seen better films of this kind. It did remind me a lot of like a John Borowski film, where it's kind of it's more in line with its artistic vision that also happens to be a documentary. Lots of dramatization, but it really is only interviewed by people involved with the case. I think the only outsider would be James Ellroy, but he's still a true crime writer. It wasn't the most factual thing I've seen. I mean, if you want to read something more factual, I would just pick up a book by Bob Berdella. I mean, for the most part, it's right. I probably would have liked more if it wasn't so dramatization heavy and went more just in depth. Like, instead of the dramatization of the kills and almost kind of trying to make this sick, twisted kind of Chainsaw Massacre type film, rather just have like police or the medical examiners or people that talk to Berdella go over what he did to the victims. I probably would have just preferred that. But this definitely does feel like a Troma version of a John Borowski film, which, if you've seen a John Borowski film, if you've seen Troma, kind of anything by Troma, you'll kind of know what I mean. But then again, the tone did kind of fit just with the story. So it's definitely worth of checking out. And definitely with the title like Bazaar, it makes sense that this is kind of a bizarre documentary anyway. So I don't really have a whole lot to say about it as far as opinion. I've actually already said everything. But yeah, it's definitely worth checking out. I think you can find this for free on YouTube. Again, I probably would have much rather had like an A&E biography of Bob Berdella or something. It does have its very silly moments, but it was still interesting to see a Bob Berdella documentary. So the only other one I have planned would be the 2011 Willie Pickton documentary, The Pig Farm. So you can look forward to that, and thank you for watching.